good evening, and welcome. Whether you're settling down for the night in Lagos or wherever this message finds you around the world, I'm grateful you're here. Before we begin our journey tonight, if you find value in these carefully researched stories, please consider subscribing. Your support helps us continue bringing you thoughtful, true crime content designed to accompany your rest. Tonight's story is unlike any we've told before. It's not a traditional mystery with clues to follow or a killer to unmask. Instead, it's a story that asks profound questions about consciousness itself, about the boundary between sleep and waking, about responsibility and intent, about what it means to be truly present in our own actions. This is the story of Kenneth Parks, a young man who, on a spring night in 1987, drove 14 miles through the suburbs of Toronto and committed an act of terrible violence. But here's what makes this case extraordinary. Kenneth Parks claimed he was asleep the entire time, and after years of investigation, testimony from leading experts, and landmark legal proceedings, the courts believed him. So settle into your pillows, adjust your blankets, take a slow, deep breath, and let's journey together into one of the most fascinating intersections of law, medicine, and human consciousness ever documented. In the spring of 1987, Kenneth James Parks was 23 years old. He lived in Pickering, Ontario, a suburban community just east of Toronto, with his wife Karen and their 5-month-old daughter. On the surface, they seemed like any young family trying to build a life together. Kenneth was a gentle man, soft-spoken and well-liked by those who knew him. His mother-in-law, Barbara Woods, affectionately called him her gentle giant. But beneath this ordinary exterior, Kenneth's life was quietly unraveling. It had started innocently enough, the way these things often do. Kenneth had developed a fondness for betting on horse races. First, it was recreational, something fun to do with friends. But gradually, imperceptibly, it became something more. The occasional bet became regular gambling. The regular gambling became a compulsion, and the compulsion became a crisis. Kenneth worked for Revere Electric, and he was good at his job. But the gambling debts mounted. $20,000, then $25,000, then $30,000. The numbers grew beyond anything his salary could hope to cover. He borrowed from friends. He drained the family savings account, money he and Karen had set aside for their future. And when that wasn't enough, Kenneth made a decision that would haunt him. He began taking money from his employer, $32,000. That's how much he embezzled over time, always telling himself he'd win it back, that the next bet would be the one that made everything right again. He'd return the money before anyone noticed. No one would be hurt. It was a loan, really just a temporary loan. But gambling debts don't work that way. The money disappeared, bet by bet, race after race. And in March 1987, about 2 months before that fateful night, the theft was discovered. Kenneth was fired immediately. Criminal charges were filed. His secret, the one he'd been carrying alone, was suddenly exposed to everyone who mattered. For Kenneth, this period was a descent into darkness. He stopped socializing. He gained weight. He suffered from debilitating headaches. And most significantly, he couldn't sleep. Insomnia gripped him, night after night, as his mind churned through the wreckage of what he'd done and the uncertain future that awaited him. His marriage was strained nearly to breaking. Karen was devastated by the betrayal, by the lies, by the financial ruin. For a time, they were sleeping in separate beds, their relationship hanging by the thinnest thread. But there was a small glimmer of hope. On May 20th, 1987, just 4 days before the incident, Kenneth attended his first Gamblers Anonymous meeting. It was a beginning, a first step toward addressing the addiction that had destroyed so much. The counselors encouraged him to be honest with his family, to confess the full extent of his problems and begin the work of making amends. Kenneth agreed. He would tell everyone the truth. He made plans to visit his in-laws on Sunday, May 24th. Barbara and Dennis Woods had always been supportive. Despite everything, despite the financial chaos and the criminal charges, they'd offered to help Kenneth and Karen financially. Barbara still called him her gentle giant. They still trusted him with a key to their home. The confession would be difficult, humiliating even, but Kenneth was prepared to face it. He would tell them about the gambling, the embezzlement, the charges, everything. It was time to stop running from the truth. On Saturday night, May 23, 1987, Kenneth settled onto the couch in his living home to watch television. Saturday Night Live was on. He was exhausted, his mind heavy with thoughts of the conversation he would have with his in-laws the next day. His body, deprived of proper sleep for weeks, ached for rest. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, Kenneth Parks fell asleep on that couch. What happened next would change his life forever and challenge everything we think we understand about consciousness, responsibility, and the sleeping mind. The human brain during sleep is a mystery we're still unraveling. When we drift off, our consciousness doesn't simply switch off like a light. Instead, we move through stages, cycling between different types of sleep throughout the night. There's REM sleep, where we dream vividly, our eyes moving rapidly beneath closed lids. And there's non-REM sleep, which includes the deep, restorative slow-wave sleep where our brains produce long, slow delta waves. For most of us, these stages progress normally. Our body has built-in systems to keep us still while we sleep, to prevent us from acting out our dreams. But for some people, these systems don't work quite right. Sleepwalking, known medically as somnambulism, occurs when someone becomes partially aroused from deep sleep but remains fundamentally unconscious. They can move, walk, even perform complex actions, all while their conscious mind remains dormant. Kenneth Parks had a history of this condition. It ran in his family. His grandfather would cook elaborate meals in his sleep but never eat them. Kenneth's mother remembered finding her teenage son one night trying to climb out of a sixth-floor window, still completely asleep. These weren't frequent episodes, but they were real. The tendency was there, encoded somehow in his neurology, waiting for the right combination of triggers. Stress, sleep deprivation, anxiety. These are known precipitating factors for sleepwalking episodes, particularly in people predisposed to the condition. And on that Saturday night in May 1987, Kenneth had all three in abundance. Sometime after falling asleep on the couch, Kenneth got up. He put on his coat. He walked to his car, got inside, and started the engine. The route he drove was familiar, a path he'd traveled many times. Pickering to Scarborough, the neighboring suburb where his in-laws lived. Approximately 14 miles or 23 kilometers. He drove carefully, apparently obeying traffic laws, navigating the streets in the pre-dawn darkness. At some point during this drive, he stopped at his own car's trunk and removed something. A tire iron, a heavy metal bar used for changing tires. He arrived at the Woods family home around 4 o'clock in the morning. The house was dark. Everyone inside was sleeping. Kenneth used the key they had given him, the key that symbolized their trust in him, to unlock the door and enter. Inside, he made his way to the bedroom where Barbara and Dennis Woods slept. What happened next was an act of horrific violence. Kenneth attacked his father-in-law first, attempting to strangle Dennis with his bare hands. Dennis Woods, suddenly awakened by the attack, fought back desperately. The struggle was fierce. Then Kenneth turned on Barbara. He struck her repeatedly with the tire iron, the blows falling with terrible force. Then he went to the kitchen and took a knife from the drawer. He stabbed both Barbara and Dennis multiple times. During the attack, Kenneth severed tendons in both of his own hands. These were serious injuries, the kind that would normally cause excruciating pain. But Kenneth showed no reaction to them, no recognition of his own wounds. He continued the assault as if he felt nothing at all. Barbara and Woods, aged 42, died from her injuries. The gentle woman who had called Kenneth her gentle giant, who had offered to help him despite his troubles, was killed in her own bedroom. Dennis Woods survived, but barely. The injuries were severe, life-threatening. He would carry the physical and psychological scars of that morning for the rest of his life. After the attack, Kenneth returned to his car. His hands were bleeding profusely. His clothes were soaked with blood. He got behind the wheel and drove, not home, but to the nearest police station. He walked into the building, holding up his damaged hands, and said to the officers on duty, "I think I have just killed 2 people. My hands." The police initially thought he was confessing, and in a sense, he was. But Kenneth Parks wasn't trying to turn himself in for a crime he remembered committing. He was asking for help, genuinely confused and horrified by what he was seeing, what he was holding, the blood that covered him. He appeared to be emerging from a fog, looking down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time and not understanding how they'd gotten that way. The police arrested Kenneth Parks immediately. How could they not? Here was a young man, covered in blood, with wounds on his hands, confessing to killing 2 people. The evidence seemed straightforward. Within hours, investigators confirmed the victims' identities: Barbara and Dennis Woods, Kenneth's in-laws. From a prosecutorial standpoint, the case appeared open and shut. Kenneth had motive, he was facing the humiliation of confessing his gambling addiction and embezzlement to these people. He had opportunity, he had a key to their home. He had means, he'd used weapons from his own car and their kitchen, and he'd essentially confessed at the police station. But as detectives began questioning Kenneth, something didn't quite fit. He was cooperative, almost eerily so. He answered every question put to him. He didn't try to construct alibis or lawyer up immediately. Instead, he kept saying the same thing with complete consistency. He didn't remember. The last thing he remembered was falling asleep on his couch watching television. The next thing he remembered was being in the Woods house, looking down at Barbara's face, her eyes and mouth frozen wide in death, then fragments. Going downstairs, starting his car, realizing there was a knife in his hands, throwing the knife on the floor of the car, driving to the police station. Detectives tried repeatedly to trip him up, to find inconsistencies in his story. They interviewed him multiple times, asking the same questions in different ways, looking for the telltale signs that he was constructing a false narrative. But Kenneth's story never changed. Every detail remained exactly the same, no matter how many times he was asked. Even more puzzling was the complete lack of apparent motive. Yes, Kenneth had financial problems and was scheduled to confess to his in-laws the next day. But by all accounts, the Woods were supportive. They'd offered to help financially. Barbara adored Kenneth. Why would he kill the people most likely to stand by him? And then there were Kenneth's injuries. He'd severed tendons in both hands during the attack, serious wounds that would have caused immediate, intense pain. Yet he'd continued driving, had walked into the police station, all while appearing completely unaware of these injuries. He hadn't tried to bandage them or even seemed to notice them until he was at the station. Kenneth's wife, Karen, was brought in for questioning. Despite the devastation of recent months, despite the lies and the betrayal around his gambling, she told investigators that Kenneth had never been violent. She'd never feared him. She confirmed that he'd had no motive to hurt her parents and that he'd been genuinely looking forward to talking with them, to coming clean and starting fresh. As the initial shock of the arrest wore off, Kenneth's defense attorney began exploring an unusual possibility. Kenneth had mentioned his sleep problems, his family history of sleepwalking. Could it be possible, the attorney wondered, that Kenneth had been sleepwalking during the attack? That he had been genuinely unconscious during these terrible acts? The idea seemed almost absurd. How could someone drive a car, navigate to a specific address, enter a house, and carry out a sustained violent attack all while asleep? The complexity of the actions seemed to argue against it. Surely consciousness would be required for such a sequence of events. But as the attorney dug deeper into the medical literature on sleepwalking, she discovered something remarkable. There were precedents. Not many, but they existed. Cases where people had performed complex, even violent actions while in a state of somnambulism. The medical term for it was automatism, behavior performed without conscious awareness or intent. The defense team made a decision. They would argue that Kenneth Parks could not be held criminally responsible for his actions because, at the time of the attack, he had been asleep. He had been in a state of non-insane automatism, a condition where the body acts but the mind is not present. It was a gamble, a defense that had never been successfully used in Canadian criminal law. But Kenneth's attorney believed it was the truth. and she set about building a case to prove it. To understand the defense that Kenneth Park's legal team would present, we need to understand what happens in the brain during sleepwalking. When we sleep normally, our brain cycles through different stages roughly every 90 minutes. We start in light sleep, progress to deep sleep, then enter REM sleep where we dream, then cycle back again. During deep sleep, particularly the stage called slow wave sleep, our brain produces delta waves, long, slow electrical oscillations that sweep across the brain's cortex. This is the most restorative phase of sleep. It's when our body repairs tissues, consolidates memories, and replenishes energy for the next day. During this phase, the thinking part of our brain, the cortex, is essentially offline. As one expert would later describe it, during slow-wave sleep, the cortex is in a coma. Sleepwalking occurs when someone is partially aroused from this deep sleep but doesn't fully wake up. The parts of the brain that control movement and basic navigation can become active, but the higher cognitive functions, judgment, decision-making, consciousness itself, remain dormant. The person is in a twilight state, neither fully asleep nor fully awake. During a sleepwalking episode, a person can perform remarkably complex actions. They can walk around their house, navigate obstacles, even have simple conversations. Their eyes are typically open, and they appear to be awake to outside observers. But they're not processing information the way a conscious person does. They're operating on autopilot, following familiar patterns and responding to immediate stimuli without higher-level thought. Most sleepwalking episodes are benign. A person gets up, wanders around for a few minutes, perhaps rearranges objects or goes to the bathroom, then returns to bed with no memory of the event. But in rare cases, sleepwalking can lead to more complex or even violent behavior. The medical literature documented this, though the cases were uncommon. There were approximately 30 documented cases worldwide of homicides committed during sleepwalking episodes at the time of Kenneth's trial. Each case shared certain characteristics: a family history of sleep disorders, extreme stress or sleep deprivation as triggers, complex but automatic behaviors, lack of motive, absence of attempts to hide the crime, no memory of the event, and often a confused or distressed state upon regaining consciousness. Kenneth's case checked every one of these boxes. For the defense to succeed, they would need to prove several things to the jury. First, that Kenneth had indeed been sleepwalking during the attack. Second, that this was a genuine medical condition, not a convenient excuse. Third, that Kenneth had not been conscious during his actions and therefore could not have formed the intent necessary for criminal liability. And fourth, and this was crucial from a legal standpoint, that Kenneth's sleepwalking should be classified as non-insane automatism rather than a disease of the mind. This distinction mattered enormously. If sleepwalking was deemed a disease of the mind, Kenneth would be found not guilty by reason of insanity and could be confined indefinitely in a psychiatric facility. But if it was non-insane automatism, triggered by external factors like stress rather than an internal mental illness, he could be fully acquitted with no further confinement. The defense assembled an impressive team of experts to examine Kenneth and testify about his condition. There was Dr. Roger Broughton, a neurophysiologist and leading specialist in sleep disorders; Dr. John Edmeades, a neurologist; Dr. Ronald Billings, a psychiatrist; Dr. Robert Hill, a forensic psychiatrist; and Dr. Frank Irvin, a neurologist and psychiatrist. 5 of the most respected minds in their fields, all brought together to understand what had happened to Kenneth Parks that night. The medical evaluation of Kenneth Parks was exhaustive. The experts conducted electroencephalography tests, or EEG, measuring the electrical activity in Kenneth's brain during sleep. What they found was striking. Kenneth's brain wave patterns during sleep were abnormal, even compared to other people with sleep disorders. The EEG readings were impossible to fake. The specific patterns of electrical activity in the brain during different sleep stages can't be voluntarily controlled or mimicked. The tests showed that Kenneth did indeed suffer from a parasomnia, a disorder characterized by abnormal behavior during sleep. The experts also documented Kenneth's family history: his grandfather's nocturnal cooking, Kenneth's own teenage episode trying to climb out a window while asleep, his mother's testimony about these incidents, his wife's observation that when Kenneth was in deep sleep, He was extremely difficult to wake and often talked without awareness. Then there was the question of motive, or rather, the complete absence of it. Kenneth had maintained an excellent relationship with his in-laws despite his troubles. Barbara Woods had called him her gentle giant. They were planning to help him and Karen financially. There was no history of violence, no previous threats, no escalating anger. The attack seemed to come from nowhere, motiveless and inexplicable, unless Kenneth truly hadn't been conscious during it. Dr. Broughton and his colleagues examined the events of that night in detail. The stress of Kenneth's situation was extreme. He'd been fired, charged with embezzlement, his marriage was in crisis, and he was suffering from severe insomnia. These were exactly the kind of precipitating factors known to trigger sleepwalking episodes in people predisposed to the condition. The drive to Scarborough was along a familiar route, one Kenneth had traveled many times. Sleepwalkers can navigate familiar environments, following deeply ingrained patterns of movement. The route would have been almost automatic for him, requiring no conscious thought. The violence of the attack, while shocking, was also consistent with certain types of sleepwalking episodes, particularly when the sleepwalker is startled or restrained. The experts theorized that Dennis Woods, finding his son-in-law wandering in their home, probably tried to wake or restrain Kenneth. To Kenneth's sleeping brain, this might have been perceived as an attack, triggering a fight-or-flight response. Without his conscious mind to mediate, to recognize his father-in-law, to understand what was happening, Kenneth's brain responded with pure instinct, violent, uncontrolled, and terrible. Perhaps most telling was Kenneth's complete unawareness of his own injuries. He'd severed tendons in both hands, injuries that should have been agonizingly painful. Yet he'd continued driving, walked into the police station, all without any apparent reaction to this pain. This suggested a level of dissociation from physical sensation consistent with being in a deep sleep state. The experts also addressed the question of whether this could happen again. Their conclusion: unlikely. Sleepwalking episodes of this severity typically require a perfect storm of factors: genetic predisposition, extreme stress, severe sleep deprivation, and specific triggers all combining at once. With proper sleep hygiene, stress management, and medication if needed, the risk of recurrence was minimal. Kenneth was not a danger to society. He was a man who had experienced an extraordinarily rare confluence of circumstances that would almost certainly never align again. All 5 experts reached the same conclusion: Kenneth Parks had been in a state of automatism during the attack. He had been sleepwalking, genuinely unconscious, with no awareness of his actions and no ability to form criminal intent. From a medical standpoint, they were unanimous. The trial of Kenneth Parks began in 1988, more than a year after that terrible night in May. It was a high-profile case, covered extensively by the media, debated in homes and workplaces across Canada. People were fascinated and horrified in equal measure. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They argued that Kenneth had motive. He was facing humiliation and consequences for his actions. They pointed out the complexity of what he'd done: driving a car, navigating to a specific location, carrying out a sustained attack. How could all of this happen while someone was truly asleep? Surely, they argued, some level of conscious awareness must have been present. This was either outright murder, committed with full awareness, or a clever attempt to escape responsibility for a planned killing. But the defense's case was compelling. The medical evidence was powerful and unanimous. 5 experts, all at the top of their fields, had independently examined Kenneth and reached the same conclusion. The EEG readings were conclusive. The family history was documented. The lack of motive was clear. The injury to Kenneth's own hands and his unawareness of them suggested genuine unconsciousness. Kenneth's wife Karen took the stand, a painful moment for everyone. She testified that despite everything, the lies, the gambling, the betrayal, Kenneth had never been violent. She believed he hadn't been conscious during the attack. She confirmed his lack of motive and his good relationship with her parents. The defense also emphasized a crucial point. Kenneth had turned himself in immediately. He hadn't tried to flee, hadn't tried to cover up what happened, hadn't attempted to construct an alibi. These were not the actions of someone trying to get away with murder. They were the actions of someone genuinely confused and horrified by what he was seeing. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. 9 hours to wrestle with one of the most difficult questions any jury has ever faced. Can a person be held criminally responsible for actions committed while genuinely unconscious? On May 25, 1988, the jury returned with their verdict. Not guilty. Kenneth Parks was acquitted of both murder and attempted murder. The jury had believed the medical evidence. They accepted that Kenneth had been sleepwalking, that he had not been conscious during the attack, and that therefore he could not be held criminally responsible for his actions. The verdict was controversial. Some people saw it as justice, a recognition that criminal responsibility requires consciousness and intent. Others saw it as a dangerous precedent, worried that it might open the door for violent offenders to escape punishment by claiming they'd been asleep. But the verdict stood. Kenneth Parks walked out of court a free man. The Crown, troubled by the implications, appealed the decision. The case worked its way up through the Canadian legal system until it reached the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court of Canada. The question before the court wasn't whether Kenneth had been sleepwalking. That seemed established. The question was whether sleepwalking should be classified as a disease of the mind, which would have required Kenneth's confinement, or as non-insane automatism, which supported his acquittal. On a cold day in 1992, 5 years after the tragedy, the Supreme Court of Canada delivered its decision. Chief Justice Antonio Lamer, writing for the court, upheld the acquittal. The court agreed that sleepwalking, triggered by external factors like extreme stress and sleep deprivation, constituted non-insane automatism. It was not a disease of the mind, but rather a sleep disorder, and Kenneth could not be held criminally responsible for actions committed while in that state. The decision became a landmark in Canadian criminal law, cited in legal textbooks and law schools around the world. R.V. Parks set a precedent for how automatism defenses would be evaluated in future cases. After his acquittal was upheld by the Supreme Court, Kenneth Parks was placed on medication to manage his sleep disorders. He received treatment for his gambling addiction, and according to the limited information available, he never experienced another sleepwalking episode of any severity. He reportedly turned his life around, though he did so away from the public eye, understandably seeking privacy after the intense scrutiny of the trial and its aftermath. But what of Dennis Woods, the man who survived that terrible night? He lost his wife in a horrific attack and suffered severe injuries himself, physical and psychological wounds that would never fully heal. The justice system's decision that Kenneth couldn't be held responsible provided a legal resolution but likely little emotional closure. How does one process being attacked by a person who wasn't, in a meaningful sense, present during the attack? The Kenneth Parks case raises profound questions that continue to resonate. If our bodies can commit acts of violence while our conscious minds are absent, what does that tell us about the nature of consciousness itself? Where does responsibility reside? In the conscious mind that makes decisions, or in the body that carries out actions? The legal system requires intent for criminal liability. This isn't arbitrary. It's a recognition that punishment only makes sense when directed at a conscious agent who chose to commit a wrong. But the Parks case shows us that the relationship between body and mind, between action and awareness, is more complex than our usual assumptions allow. The case also highlights how rare and strange such events are. Since the Parks decision in 1992, there have been only a handful of successful sleepwalking defenses in Canada. The evidentiary requirements are stringent. Courts demand extensive medical evidence, clear documentation of sleep disorders, demonstrable lack of motive, and proof that the person couldn't have been faking their condition. The vast majority of violent crime is committed by people who are fully conscious, and the justice system treats it accordingly. But Kenneth Parks serves as a reminder that human consciousness is not a simple on-off switch. There are states in between, twilight zones where our bodies move and act while our minds remain dormant. And when tragedy strikes in those states, we're forced to confront difficult questions about blame, responsibility, and what it means to be present in our own lives. And so we come to the end of Kenneth Parks' story, though like many true stories, it doesn't have a neat resolution. A woman died. A man was permanently scarred. A young man's life was irrevocably changed by actions his mind never consciously chose. The legal system did its best to apply principles of justice to a situation that defied easy categorization. What can we take from this case as we drift towards sleep tonight? Perhaps a recognition of how mysterious we are to ourselves. Our brains are working constantly, even when we're not aware of it. The boundary between conscious and unconscious is more permeable, more complex than we usually acknowledge. It's also a story about stress, about how the pressures we carry can manifest in unexpected ways. Kenneth's sleepwalking episode occurred during a period of extreme psychological strain. His case serves as a sobering reminder of the importance of managing stress, getting adequate sleep, and seeking help when life becomes overwhelming. But mostly, it's a story about the questions we continue to grapple with. What makes us responsible for our actions? Where does the self reside? What are the limits of consciousness? These are questions without easy answers, questions that philosophers and scientists and legal scholars continue to debate. Kenneth Park's case gave us one answer, specific to one man on one terrible night. But the larger questions remain, as mysterious and fascinating as ever. As you close your eyes tonight, moving through your own cycles of sleep, through stages of consciousness and unconsciousness, perhaps you'll think about the remarkable complexity of the mind, how it can dream and process and work through problems even when you're not aware of it, how it protects you usually from acting out those dreams, how it creates your experience of being you. Sleep well, rest easy, and be grateful for the ordinary miracle that happens every night. The peaceful transition into unconsciousness and back again, without incident, without drama, just the gentle rhythm of a mind and body working in harmony. Thank you for joining me tonight. If you found this story thought-provoking, please consider subscribing for more carefully researched true crime content. Until next time, good night. Story 2. Good evening and welcome. Whether you're winding down in Lagos or settling in elsewhere around the world, thank you for being here tonight. Before we begin, if you find these carefully researched stories meaningful, please consider subscribing to stay connected with more thoughtful true crime content designed for your rest. Tonight, we travel back to a different Los Angeles. Not the city of smartphones and social media, but the Los Angeles of 1947. A city emerging from war, full of dreamers and shadows, where Hollywood glamour existed alongside darker realities that the silver screen never showed. It was a place where young women arrived daily with suitcases full of hope and hearts full of dreams, not all of which would come true. This is the story of one such young woman. Her name was Elizabeth Short, though the world would come to know her by another name entirely, the Black Dahlia. Her life was brief, only 22 years, but her death would echo through nearly 8 decades, becoming one of the most infamous unsolved murders in American history. We'll walk gently through Elizabeth's life tonight, honoring who she was before that terrible January morning. We'll explore the world she inhabited, the dreams she chased, and the mystery that has captivated generations. There's no rush, just let the story unfold, moment by moment, like memories surfacing from the past. Take a deep breath, let yourself settle, and let's begin our journey into the heart of old Hollywood's most enduring mystery. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29, 1924, in the Hyde Park section of Boston, Massachusetts. She arrived into a world still adjusting to the aftermath of the Great War, a world of parlor music and silent films, when summers were spent on front porches and winters huddled around coal stoves. She was the third daughter born to Cleo Alvin Short and Phoebe May Sawyer Short, joining her sisters Virginia and Dorothea. 2 more sisters, Eleanor and Muriel, would follow. The Short family called her Betty. Later, some would call her Beth or Bet. She was a pretty child with striking features that would only become more pronounced as she grew. Pale skin that seemed almost translucent, dark hair, and blue eyes that some said could change shades depending on what she wore, sometimes appearing almost green. The family moved several times during Elizabeth's early childhood, eventually settling in Medford, Massachusetts, a quiet suburb of Boston. Her father, Cleo, was an enterprising man who had found a niche business building miniature golf courses. In the late 1920s, miniature golf was sweeping the nation as a recreational craze, and for a time, the Short family enjoyed a comfortable middle-class existence. But then came October 1929, and the stock market crashed. The economic devastation that followed touched nearly every American family, and the Shorts were no exception. Cleo lost most of his savings virtually overnight. The miniature golf business, which had seemed so promising, collapsed along with the economy. What had been financial security became financial ruin. The year 1930 brought an even more profound shock. One autumn day, Cleo's car was found abandoned on the Charlestown Bridge over the Charles River in Boston. There was no note, no explanation, no body. The assumption seemed inescapable. Cleo Short had taken his own life, unable to bear the weight of his financial failures and the responsibility of providing for 5 young daughters and a wife. Phoebe Short was suddenly a widow, or so she believed, left alone with 5 daughters to raise during the depths of the Great Depression. She sold their house and moved the family into a small apartment on Salem Street in Medford. She found work as a bookkeeper, her days consumed with numbers and ledgers, trying to stretch every dollar to feed and clothe her girls. It was a hard life, but Phoebe was determined that her daughters would not suffer more than necessary. Elizabeth grew up in this atmosphere of careful economy and fatherless uncertainty. She attended local schools, where classmates remembered her as a lively girl with a bright personality, always eager to engage with others. She developed a love for movies. They were affordable entertainment, an escape from the dreariness of Depression-era life. In the darkness of the movie theater, Elizabeth could dream of other lives, other worlds, other possibilities. But Elizabeth's childhood held another challenge beyond poverty and her father's absence. She suffered from severe asthma and chronic bronchitis. In an era before modern treatments, these respiratory conditions were serious, even life-threatening. At 15, she underwent lung surgery. Her doctors recommended that she spend winters in warmer climates, away from the harsh Massachusetts cold that aggravated her breathing. And so, beginning around 1940, when she was 16, Elizabeth began spending winters in Florida with relatives, living with family friends in Miami Beach. She would return to Medford for the warmer months, this annual migration between cold and warmth becoming part of the rhythm of her teenage years. It was during one of these Florida winters that Elizabeth discovered something astonishing. In 1942, the family received a letter that changed everything. Cleo Short, the father they had mourned, the man they believed had drowned himself in the Charles River 12 years earlier, was alive. He hadn't committed suicide at all. He had simply left, walking away from his family to start a new life in California. Now, after more than a decade, he was finally reaching out, asking for forgiveness. Phoebe refused to reconcile with him. The abandonment, the years of struggle, the deception, it was too much. But Elizabeth was different. Elizabeth, perhaps hungry for a father she'd never known, perhaps drawn by the allure of California, perhaps simply ready for a new start, decided she wanted to know him. She began corresponding with Cleo, and in 1943, when she was 19, Elizabeth made a decision that would change the trajectory of her short life. She was going to California. In early 1943, Elizabeth Short traveled across the country to Vallejo, California, where her father was living and working at Mare Island Naval Shipyard on San Francisco Bay. America was deep into World War II by then, and the shipyards were operating around the clock, building and repairing naval vessels. It was a time of unprecedented activity, opportunity, and change. But the reunion between father and daughter did not go as Elizabeth might have hoped. Cleo had built a new life without his family, and he had strong opinions about how a young woman should behave. Elizabeth, now a young adult with her own ideas and habits, chafed under his criticism. He disapproved of her laziness around the house, her poor housekeeping, and most especially her active dating life. The clashes escalated until, by mid-1943, Cleo threw her out. At 19, Elizabeth found herself alone in California with nowhere to go and very little money. She needed work, and she found it at Camp Cook, now Vandenberg Air Force Base, near Lompoc, working in the post exchange. The military base was full of young servicemen preparing for deployment, and Elizabeth's striking appearance didn't go unnoticed. She won a local beauty contest, earning the title Camp Cutie of Camp Cook. But Elizabeth was, by all accounts, a romantic who wanted something deeper than casual dates. She dreamed of marriage, of security, of being chosen by someone who would truly love her. Word spread among the servicemen that Elizabeth wasn't what they called an easy girl. She had boundaries, expectations, dreams of something more permanent. This reputation, while protecting her in some ways, also meant many lonely nights. Her time at Camp Cook was brief. She moved to Santa Barbara, staying with friends, trying to find her footing. It was there, in September 1943, that Elizabeth had her only encounter with the law. She was arrested for underage drinking. She was 19, and the drinking age was 21. The police officer who processed her felt sympathetic to this pretty, lost-seeming girl. Rather than prosecuting her, he arranged for her to be sent back to Massachusetts. But Elizabeth couldn't stay away from California. Despite the struggles, despite the disappointments, something about the West Coast called to her. Maybe it was the climate that helped her breathing. Maybe it was the distance from her childhood poverty. Maybe it was the dream that so many young women shared in that era, the dream of becoming a movie star. In Miami Beach, during one of her winter sojourns, Elizabeth met someone who seemed to embody all her hopes. His name was Major Matthew Michael Gordon Jr., a decorated United States Army Air Force officer. He was handsome, heroic, a man in uniform during wartime. Everything Elizabeth had been dreaming of. They fell in love quickly, as people often did during the war years when tomorrow was never guaranteed. They became engaged. Elizabeth told friends that Matt had written to her from India, proposing marriage while recovering from injuries sustained in an airplane crash. But on August 10, 1945, just days before the war would end, Matt Gordon's plane crashed again. This time, he didn't survive. Elizabeth's dream of marriage, of stability, of building a life with someone who loved her, died with him. She was 21 years old and had lost the future she'd been planning. By July 1946, Elizabeth was back in California, specifically Los Angeles. She came to visit an old boyfriend named Joseph Fickling, but Fickling had moved to another state. Once again, Elizabeth found herself adrift, this time in the sprawling, anonymous city of Los Angeles. The Los Angeles of 1946 was a city of contrasts. The war had ended, servicemen were returning home, and the economy was booming. Hollywood was producing films at a furious pace, and the Dream Factory was running at full capacity. But housing was scarce, jobs for women were limited, and beneath the glamorous surface, the city could be a hard, unforgiving place for a young woman with no family, no money, and no connections. Elizabeth moved frequently, never staying anywhere long. She lived in hotels when she could afford them, stayed with acquaintances when she couldn't. She took modeling jobs occasionally, though she had no known acting credits or regular employment in the film industry. She worked as a waitress to pay for meals and lodging. Despite what some sensationalized accounts would later claim, those who knew Elizabeth said she didn't drink or smoke, was courteous and polite, and never swore. She was, by all accounts, still hoping for respectability, still dreaming of something better. She dated widely. Friends estimated she'd known at least 50 men by the end of 1946. She seemed to be searching for something, or someone, who could offer her the stability and love that had eluded her since Matt Gordon's death. An address book found after her death would list numerous male names, a testament to her social life and perhaps to her desperate search for connection in a city where she felt increasingly alone. By late 1946 and early 1947, Elizabeth had earned a nickname among her acquaintances in Long Beach. They called her the Black Dahlia. The name referenced her preference for wearing black clothing, black dresses that emphasized her pale skin and dark hair. And it echoed the title of the 1946 film noir The Blue Dahlia, which had recently been released. It was the kind of nickname that might seem glamorous, mysterious, film noir romantic. Elizabeth had no way of knowing that this nickname would follow her into death and beyond, that it would become more famous than her real name, that decades after she was gone, the world would still be saying those two words, Black Dahlia. On January 8, 1947, Elizabeth left San Diego with Robert Red Manley, a married salesman she'd been dating. He drove her back to Los Angeles and paid for her hotel room at the Biltmore Hotel for the night. They attended a party together. When they returned, Manley slept on the bed while Elizabeth slept in a chair. The next morning, January 9th, Manley picked her up around noon. Elizabeth told him she was planning to meet her married sister at the Biltmore Hotel in Hollywood before eventually returning to Massachusetts. Manley dropped her off at the Biltmore around 6:30 p.m. He watched her walk into the lobby, her figure disappearing among the other travelers and hotel guests. It was the last confirmed sighting of Elizabeth Short alive. 6 days later, her body would be found, and the mystery that began on that January evening would never truly end. January 15, 1947, dawned clear and cool in Los Angeles. It was a Wednesday morning, ordinary in every way, until it suddenly wasn't. At approximately 10 a.m., Betty Berzinger was walking down Norton Avenue in the Leimert Park section of South Los Angeles. She was pushing her 3-year-old daughter in a stroller, perhaps enjoying the mild weather, perhaps running errands, living an ordinary morning of an ordinary life. The neighborhood was still developing, with vacant lots scattered among the houses, patches of weedy ground waiting for the post-war housing boom to fill them with homes. As Betty walked past one such vacant lot on the 3800 block of South Norton Avenue, something caught her eye. At first glance, she thought it was a mannequin lying in the weeds. The body was so pale, so white, so still that it seemed artificial, like a department store dummy that had been dumped in the lot. But as Betty looked closer, the terrible truth became clear. This was not a mannequin. This was a woman's body, and it had been positioned deliberately, carefully, almost theatrically, just a few feet from the sidewalk. Betty rushed to a nearby house and called the police. Within minutes, officers arrived at the scene, and what they found would haunt Los Angeles for decades to come. The body was that of a young woman, nude, posed with her arms raised above her head and bent at the elbows, her legs spread apart. The most horrifying aspect was immediately apparent. The body had been cut cleanly in half at the waist. The two sections had been placed near each other but were completely severed, the bisection so precise it suggested someone with surgical knowledge. There were other mutilations. Deep gashes had been carved from the corners of her mouth to her ear sides, creating what's known as a Glasgow smile, a grotesque parody of a grin that left her face frozen in a horrible rictus. There were other cuts and lacerations across the body, but perhaps most disturbing of all, there was no blood. Not at the scene, not on the body. The corpse had been thoroughly washed, drained of blood, scrubbed clean. This wasn't a crime of passion committed in a moment of rage. This was methodical, deliberate, careful. The body had obviously been killed elsewhere and then transported to this location. The killer wanted the body to be found, wanted it displayed in this public way, positioned just off the sidewalk where someone would certainly discover it. The Los Angeles Police Department launched what would become one of the largest murder investigations in the city's history. Hundreds of officers were deployed. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed witnesses, searched for any evidence that might identify the victim or the killer. Meanwhile, the body was taken to the county morgue for autopsy. The medical examiner's findings were grim but revealing. The victim had died from repeated blows to the head and face, causing severe hemorrhaging. She had perished from blood loss before the bisection and other mutilations occurred. A small mercy, perhaps, that she had not been conscious for all of the horrors inflicted on her body. The question now was identification. Who was this young woman? The LAPD had a potential breakthrough when they decided to try something innovative. They sent the victim's fingerprints via sound photo, a primitive fax machine technology, to the FBI in Washington, D.C. In just 56 minutes, the FBI came back with a match. The victim's fingerprints were in their system because she had once been arrested for underage drinking in Santa Barbara. Her name was Elizabeth Short. She was 22 years old. Now came the terrible task of notification. The police contacted Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe, in Massachusetts. But before they could, reporters from the Los Angeles Examiner called Phoebe with a story. They told her that Elizabeth had won a beauty contest and they wanted background information about her daughter's life. Phoebe, delighted, eager to help, shared stories about Betty, about her childhood, about her dreams. Only afterward did Phoebe learn the truth. Her daughter hadn't won anything. Her daughter was dead, murdered in the most horrible way imaginable. It was one of the most callous examples of journalistic exploitation in an era not known for media restraint. The newspapers seized on the story with fervor. The beautiful victim, the gruesome murder, the mystery. It was everything that sold papers. And they had a name ready-made for headlines. The Black Dahlia. The nickname that had followed Elizabeth in life now became permanently attached to her in death. Within days, Black Dahlia appeared in print more often than Elizabeth Short. The real woman was disappearing behind the lurid mythology. The story dominated front-page news for 35 consecutive days. The competition between LA's newspapers was fierce, and each tried to outdo the others with sensational coverage, theories, and leads. The Herald Express, the Examiner, the Times, all of them fed the public's insatiable appetite for details about the Black Dahlia murder. The investigation into Elizabeth Short's murder became a consuming obsession for the Los Angeles Police Department. Captain Jack Donahue led the effort, coordinating hundreds of officers and detectives. The case file would eventually grow to include over 750 investigators working on the case, interviewing thousands of potential witnesses, following up on hundreds of leads. The first order of business was tracing Elizabeth's movements in the days before her death. The last confirmed sighting had been on January 9th, when Red Manley dropped her at the Biltmore Hotel. What happened between January 9th and January 14th or 15th, when she was killed? These days became known as the missing week, and investigators worked tirelessly to fill in the gaps. Robert Red Manley, as the last person known to have seen Elizabeth alive, naturally became the first major suspect. He was arrested on January 19th and questioned extensively. But Manley had an alibi. He passed multiple polygraph tests, and eventually he was cleared. His wife was pregnant at the time, and he could account for his whereabouts. He was released, though the experience left him shaken. The investigation then turned to Elizabeth's address book, which contained dozens of names. Detectives tracked down approximately 75 men, interviewing each one, trying to understand Elizabeth's social circle. Most had only briefly met her. Many remembered her as friendly but reserved, someone who dated often but wasn't intimate easily. None seemed connected to her death. Then came the letters. On January 21st, someone claiming to be the killer called the office of the Examiner, congratulating the newspaper on its coverage and promising to send souvenirs of Beth Short. On January 24th, a manila envelope arrived at the newspaper offices. It was addressed to the Los Angeles Examiner and other Los Angeles papers, in letters cut from newspaper headlines and pasted together. Inside were Elizabeth's belongings: her birth certificate, her social security card, business cards, photographs, and her address book with pages torn out. The items had been cleaned with gasoline to remove fingerprints. A note, also made from cut-out newspaper letters, read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." More letters arrived over the following weeks, all made with cut-and-paste newspaper clippings, some taunting the police, some making promises. One read, "I will give up on Dahlia killing if I get 10 years. Don't try to find me." Another suggested the killer might turn himself in. But none of the letters could be definitively authenticated as coming from the real killer. Many were likely from attention seekers capitalizing on the sensational case. The confessions started coming almost immediately. In all, more than 50 people confessed to killing Elizabeth Short. The first was Army veteran Daniel Voorhees, who gave police what was demonstrably a false confession on January 28th. More would follow. Men and even one woman, all claiming to be the Black Dahlia killer. Each confession had to be investigated, verified, and ultimately dismissed. None of them matched the actual evidence known only to police. None of them were legitimate. Elizabeth's body and the surgical nature of some of the cuts, investigators theorized that the killer might have medical training. They served warrants on medical schools, interviewed surgeons and doctors, looked for anyone with the anatomical knowledge to perform such a clean bisection. This line of inquiry would prove important later, but in 1947 it led nowhere definitive. Captain Donahue told the press he believed Elizabeth had been killed in a remote building or shack on the outskirts of Los Angeles, and her body had been transported to Norton Avenue for disposal. This theory made sense. The lack of blood at the scene, the careful positioning, the clean bisection all suggested a private location where the killer could work undisturbed. Police also investigated whether Elizabeth's murder might be connected to other crimes. The so-called red lipstick murder of Jean French occurred on February 10, 1947, less than a month after Elizabeth's death. French's body was found in West Los Angeles, nude and beaten, with writing in lipstick on her stomach, "Fuck you, BD," and the letters TX below. Did BD stand for Black Dahlia? Was this the same killer? The media certainly drew connections, but investigators could never establish a definitive link. Some also looked at the Cleveland Torso murders, a series of killings between 1934 and 1938 where bodies had been dismembered, as potentially connected to Elizabeth's murder. The similarities in method were noted, but again, no concrete connection could be made. Based on the precise bisection of Elizabeth's body and the surgical nature of some of the cuts, investigators theorized that the killer might have medical training. They served warrants on medical schools, interviewed surgeons and doctors, looked for anyone with the anatomical knowledge to perform such a clean bisection. This line of inquiry would prove important later, but in 1947 it led nowhere definitive. Captain Donahue told the press he believed Elizabeth had been killed in a remote building or shack on the outskirts of Los Angeles, and her body had been transported to Norton Avenue for disposal. This theory made sense. The lack of blood at the scene, the careful positioning, the clean bisection all suggested a private location where the killer could work undisturbed. Police also investigated whether Elizabeth's murder might be connected to other crimes. The so-called red lipstick murder of Jean French occurred on February 10, 1947, less than a month after Elizabeth's death. French's body was found in West Los Angeles, nude and beaten, with writing in lipstick on her stomach, "Fuck you, BD," and the letters X below. Did BD stand for Black Dahlia? Was this the same killer? The media certainly drew connections, but investigators could never establish a definitive link. Some also looked at the Cleveland Torso murders, a series of killings between 1934 and 1938 where bodies had been dismembered, as potentially connected to Elizabeth's murder. The similarities in method were noted, but again, no concrete connection could be made. By February 1st, just 2 weeks after the body's discovery, the Los Angeles Daily News reported that the case had run into a stone wall. Leads were drying up. Despite the massive effort, despite the public attention, despite hundreds of interviews and confessions and theories, the LAPD was no closer to identifying Elizabeth Short's killer. In 1949, a new lead emerged when a man named Leslie Dillon contacted the LAPD from Florida about an acquaintance who might have committed the murder. But LAPD psychiatrist Dr. Joseph Paul DeRiver came to believe that Dillon himself, rather than his acquaintance, was the killer, possibly suffering from a split personality. Dillon was brought to Los Angeles and held for questioning. The case against Dillon fell apart. He hadn't been in Los Angeles at the time of the murder. The evidence linking him to the crime was circumstantial at best. Dillon sued the city for false imprisonment, and the mishandling of his case led to a grand jury investigation in 1949 that examined the entire LAPD investigation. The grand jury reviewed everything: the evidence, the suspects, the methods used. They examined 192 suspects who had been investigated. Their conclusion: the murder remained unsolved not because of police misconduct, but because of a lack of solid evidence. The case, they determined, was simply too difficult to solve with the available information. By 1950, the Black Dahlia murder was well on its way to becoming a cold case. The massive investigation had yielded no arrests, no charges, no justice for Elizabeth Short. The file would remain open, but active investigation would wind down. The case would haunt the LAPD for decades, a symbol of the limits of police work, a reminder that some crimes, no matter how thoroughly investigated, remain mysteries. But the story was far from over. The mystery of who killed the Black Dahlia would continue to fascinate, to haunt, to inspire theories and speculation for decades to come. For decades, the Black Dahlia case remained cold, but it never disappeared from public consciousness. Books were written, theories proposed, suspects named. But one name would come to dominate discussion of the case in the 21st century: Dr. George Hill Hodel. George Hodel was born in 1907 and raised in Los Angeles. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant man. His IQ was measured at 186, marking him as a genius. He was a musical prodigy and highly educated. He became a physician, eventually running a venereal disease clinic in downtown Los Angeles. He was also a man immersed in the Los Angeles cultural scene of the 1940s, particularly the Surrealist art movement. He was friends with famous artists and photographers, hosted parties, lived a bohemian lifestyle that mixed high culture with darker appetites. Hodel first came to police attention in 1949, not for the Black Dahlia murder, but for allegedly raping his 14-year-old daughter, Tamar. The trial was sensational and lurid. Despite testimony from 3 witnesses who said they had seen Hodel having sex with Tamar, he was acquitted in December 1949. But the trial put Hodel on the LAPD's radar. They began looking at him for other crimes, including the Black Dahlia murder. Several factors made him a person of interest. He was a physician with surgical knowledge and the anatomical expertise to bisect a body cleanly. He had been seen associating with Elizabeth Short by at least 8 witnesses. His clinic in downtown Los Angeles would have put him in contact with young women in vulnerable positions. And his acquittal in the rape trial didn't convince investigators of his innocence. It just meant they couldn't prove that particular crime beyond reasonable doubt.